So we're joined here by Jonathan Sumption, who is a former senior judge who sat on the UK Supreme Court. So there's no one better to speak to about the question of rights in modern Britain than you. So thank you for joining us, Jonathan. I want to open with a very, very basic question. What do people actually mean when they talk about rights?
They mean some fundamental rights that they have by virtue of being human. I'm skeptical about this because I think that rights are actually a creation of law, which is a social creation. Just simply as humans, people don't have rights. They get them as a result of social organization, primarily through law. We can have whatever rights we want simply by changing the law. Many countries do.
I wanted to ask you about this transition that people have discussed about positive rights versus negative rights. I think it's probably fair to say that we are moving towards a regime of positive rights being the accepted definition of what we mean by rights now. How's that happened?
Well, I think it's happening very slowly, but there are really very significant differences between positive and negative rights. It's one thing to say that the state can't do unpleasant things to you or can't allow other people to do unpleasant things to you. But the moment that you start saying that the state positively must educate you properly or ensure that you have a decent standard of living, what you are doing is creating rights which involve huge levels of expenditure. It seems to me that in a democracy, the law cannot require people, irrespective of democratic choice, to have to pay higher taxes. That must be a decision for elected representatives. And the whole notion of positive rights is inconsistent with that, because it says you must have these things, whatever people think. The thing about all rights, and particularly positive rights, is that they involve equivalent duties. You can't have a right I can't have a right without you having a corresponding obligation. So every time you create rights, somebody has got to pay. Not necessarily financially, though that's part of it. Somebody has got to give effect to those rights. It's a burden that you impose upon the rest of society.
I think that ties us quite nicely into the question of human rights, because this often comes up when people have discussions about statutory duties that a government must pay.
Yes.
And that is entirely removed from the question of whether or not it makes sense for the public finances at the time, whether or not people actually expect to even get it. It is decided in a court of law.
So well, that's not the way courts of law work. And indeed, recently, the Supreme Court has, in a number of judgments, made it absolutely clear that the expenditure of money is a democratic choice. It's not for the courts to impose an obligation to spend money on the government, which should be looking to Parliament to authorise that, and ultimately to the electorate. I mean, there was a very important case a few years ago in which the Child Poverty Action Group challenged the two-child benefit limit. Well, that's now gone anyway, but at a time when it was in force, there was a serious legal challenge to it, which got right the way to the Supreme Court, and the challenge failed on exactly that ground. So the law has, I think, remained pretty consistent about this. It doesn't accept that there is a concept of rights independent of statute, which can require the government to pay more money or to impose higher taxes.
We're slightly scapegoating lawyers here, because you'll hear constantly from politicians who say it is almost taken out of my hands. It's these judges who are putting down these decisions. Yes. But they are the lawmakers.
The judges aren't the lawmakers.
It's the politicians.
The politicians are the lawmakers. And if they don't like the way that the courts apply the law, they can change it. But they don't often do that.
But there are some circumstances where at least British politicians cannot challenge this. And I'm thinking about the European Court of Human Rights here.
Well, that is, I agree, a problem, but it's mainly a problem because the Human Rights Act of 1998, a UK statute, requires the government to have, and the courts, to have regard to the decisions of the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg. It doesn't have to do that, but that's what it's done.
What would you say to people who worry that if we were to leave the ECHR, for example, that our fundamental rights would not be protected, that without these bodies we are defenceless?
I think that really entirely depends on what is substituted for the Human Rights Convention. If you take the view, which some people do, that it should be replaced by nothing, well, I think these fears have some substance to them. But that's not my view. I think that the real problem is not with the convention, which contains rights that I think most people would probably want and quite rightly want. The real problem is with the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, which has invented a large number of new rights that are not in the convention, on the ground that basically they're consistent with, in some loose way, the spirit of the convention. Now, that's a problem if you have to have regard to what the Strasbourg Court decides, which our statutes say you do have to. Now, my view is that we should withdraw from the Human Rights Convention, but I think it's very important to qualify that by saying that what we should do instead is to incorporate the same rights into UK statute law, so that instead of this rather wild and undisciplined court deciding what the rights mean, it's done by the UK courts, who have a great deal of experience of dealing with human rights, are much more responsible in their treatment of texts like the Human Rights Convention, and are wholly independent of the government.
It's good to know. So we don't need to worry that torture is returning back to the United Kingdom.
No. I don't think there can be any question of that. Anyway, the common law was dead against torture and had been for centuries before the Human Rights Act was even thought of.
Could you explain to me what you mean by common law?
It's the law made by judges. It's obviously subject to being corrected by Parliament, which Parliament can always do. But the common law has never accepted torture as a legitimate way of extracting information. In that respect, unlike most continental legal systems used to be, I mean, of course, now all civilized legal systems ban torture. But torture was a routine instrument of police and judicial activity in most continental countries until the 19th century. But in England, it was rejected as early as the 14th century.
Why do we feel the need to have, perhaps not replaced, but at least built upon the foundation that common law had, to replace it with this universal system of rights? Why did that happen?
I think it happened partly out of a feeling that international agreements were the way of civilizing supposedly barbarous countries. And I think partly out of a desire to create a sort of fundamental law, which it would be politically difficult and possibly legally difficult to get round. I think that a lot of people, a lot of believers in international human rights law, believe in it essentially because they don't trust democratic governments to respect the sort of rights that people genuinely want. And there are countries, this one isn't, we aren't living in one, but there are countries where one can see their point. But there's no reason why people should take that view about the UK. Okay, we do some things badly in the way of rights, but basically our heart is in the right place, and has been for a long time.
Do you think we have too much law?
We probably do have too much law, because there's a tendency now to have what I would call declaratory laws. In other words, you've got a perfectly good law against whatever vice we're talking about, racial prejudice, domestic brutality, whatever. And I think there's a tendency to gold plate that by having a statute to the same effect, simply as a sort of propaganda device, and that doesn't seem to me to be a proper function of law. There's also far too much regulation, which is not cost effective. I mean, there's always a cost in deregulating things, but there's a great benefit as well. And people have great difficulty when talking about public policy in adding up pluses and minuses. They say it's very useful to have regulations doing this or that thing, and they're probably right. But it's also very costly and in some ways very damaging. And so you have to weigh up the advantages against the disadvantages. But, one classic example of this actually is supplied by the COVID pandemic. There were people who said that lockdowns were uniquely terrible. And there were people who said that they were completely wonderful, whereas the truth is that they had, in the state of knowledge that we had, they seemed to have advantages, but clearly also had disadvantages. So, as with all questions of public policy, you have to be able to look at both and learn how to add and subtract.
I suppose that leads us quite nicely into this question of people perhaps losing faith in democracy, which is why the question of where law's role in society is so pertinent. For my generation, it does seem that people are increasingly not only turning away from democracy, but turning a sympathetic ear towards autocracy.
Yes.
And I have a poll here. So this is from the John Smith Centre's youth poll. This is 16 to 29-year-olds. And they found that 27% of respondents somewhat or strongly agreed that they would prefer to live in a dictatorship rather than democracy. I mean, that's a pretty high proportion of people.
Yeah.
Why is this?
It's much smaller than the proportion we thought the opposite. But yes, I think there are a variety of reasons for this. In this country, and to some extent in other countries, young people get a raw deal. There are two aspects to this. First of all, there are issues on which young people feel very strongly, but their elders feel less strongly, and their elders vote more often and are more numerous, so they resent that. A good example is climate change. Climate change, for obvious reasons, has a much greater significance for somebody of 20 than it would for somebody of 80. And I think there's a feeling that there are some issues, of which climate change is probably the classic example, on which the need to act is obvious, but the willingness to act is not, and that makes people disenchanted with democracy, particularly among the young. Then there's a whole other class of issues where the young are effectively discriminated against by the way in which our economy is organized and by our reluctance to take radical steps to correct things. At the moment, a historically very high proportion of young people, let's say under 35, are still living with their parents. The age at which people are able to acquire their first house, which used to be sometime in the mid-20s, is now in the late 30s, especially in London. So, housing is a major issue for just about everybody, and house building is blocked by a mass of regulations, which on the whole benefit existing house owners who tend to be older. And there are other issues, tertiary education, for example, by which I mean not just universities, but apprenticeships and so on. It is currently, if you go to university, you will leave with something between £50,000 and £60,000 worth of debt.
You hit just the nail on the head for my own debt there.
Well, when I was at university in the late 60s, there were no fees at all. They were all paid by the government, and however rich your parents were, and that's sort of a halcyon age which has sort of vanished, and the same applies currently, though it needn't always be like this, with the job market. At the moment, the job market is very unfavourable to young people. That's an economic moment which will probably pass, but we don't know when. The whole system of taxation and benefits favours older people because they vote more diligently than younger people. The triple lock is an absolutely indefensible policy. It was introduced by Cameron 15 years ago because it was attractive to the main voter base of the Conservative Party, which is people over the age of 60. And nobody would now suggest that the triple lock was a good idea if we didn't already have it. But the problem about democracy is that one of the problems about democracy is that it creates huge vested interests. And once these interests exist, it's terribly difficult to get rid of them. At the moment, the Office of Budget Responsibility has produced some horrifying projections as to the proportion of GDP that will be taken up by satisfying the triple lock. It's one example of the way in which, if you take tax and benefits policy combined, it's all completely skewed in favour of an older generation, who are also, of course, the generation most likely to own a house, most likely to have paid off their mortgage, and they're sitting pretty. And I've got nothing against old people. I'm not a spring chicken myself. But I think that my generation are taking a lot more of the pot than they are morally entitled to.
When there's this feeling of urgency that people have, that something needs to change, and this is obviously not something that people are in agreement. We haven't seen politics this polarised for a very, very long time in this country.
Well, I think people are in agreement that something has to change. The problem is saying something has to change is actually a particularly useless statement.
I agree.
So unless you immediately follow it by saying in what direction it should change, and people aren't agreed about that. There's a tendency of people who are dissatisfied with life just to lash out. And that's actually the reason, I think, why people in the United States vote for Trump, or in England for Farage. These are politicians who actually don't have much of a positive program. They're just against whatever's happening. And that's an attitude which is negative and not very useful or constructive, but which has an enormous appeal. You don't have, thinking about how you want to organize your society takes a certain amount of intellectual effort. But simply saying, I'm against what's happening now, is easy.
It's also quite an easy way to insert your own solutions to a problem. We've got our new Prime Minister, Andy Burnham. Yeah. He has been discussing as his flagship new policies that he wants to have more devolved government with a view to potentially having a written constitution. What interests me here is, yes, there's clearly some kind of problem where we are simultaneously slowed down. Things take an awfully long time to get through Parliament, but are also under scrutinised, so law can often be quite badly written. But is the solution to, as perhaps people within the Labour Party might put it, to modernise the British unwritten constitution?
The British Constitution has been in roughly its current shape for a long time, but that doesn't mean it's a bad shape. And the truth is that there's absolutely nothing that a written constitution could do that an ordinary act of Parliament can't equally do. We can have whatever arrangements we like without one. Andy Burnham has said we need a written constitution in an age of devolution. Well, that's manifest nonsense. We've had devolution in Northern Ireland since 1921. You've got Scotland and Wales since 1999. We didn't need a written constitution to do that. And in many ways, a written constitution would obstruct change. That's actually the function of written constitutions. Written constitutions are designed essentially to prevent people changing things. That's why that's why they're difficult to amend without something like a referendum or a supermajority in Parliament. So the real function of a written constitution is entirely negative. It's designed to stop people changing things in a radical way. So it's actually the very reverse of what Andy Burnham says he wants.
How's the relationship between the individual and state changed in the last decade or so? Well,
it's changed consistently for much more than a decade, because the state is enormously more powerful for a large variety of reasons. One of them is that the principal safeguard against overreaction, over domination by the state, say 150 years ago, was its ignorance. Now, facilities for acquiring information and for retrieving and processing it are so sophisticated that the state doesn't lack very much information. And information is the key to bureaucratic control. So the state has become enormously more powerful, so powerful that it is frankly impossible for any constitution to protect people against despotism by the state. If you lose the culture among legislators, which values democracy and values rights, if you lose that, you're absolutely in line to be victimized by the state. That is actually what's happening in the United States. In the United States, the executive is so powerful that it's extremely difficult to stop it from doing exactly what it wants. And the only protection against that would be a vigilant court system and an independent-minded legislature. Well, the United States doesn't have either of those things. I think that we do better than the United States on both of those counts. But the direction of travel is not attractive.
I'm just thinking about the technological revolution we're currently undergoing in data processing, which is through artificial intelligence, which is constantly improving. Does that open up a new frontier of potential oppression of the state by the people?
I don't think we can say that at the moment. Artificial intelligence depends on a very, very large body of information which is already out there. So it is better at retrieving and analyzing it. So to that extent, the ability of the state to retrieve available information it will be increased by AI. But it's already very great. So I think that the difference will be one of degree and not of kind. The real danger about AI is that it may become a substitute for thinking in the same way as sat-nav has become a substitute for reading maps. We won't be able to do it anymore. And so I think that the threat that AI presents to the capacity of human beings to create and to think is a very real one. It's far too early to know how far that's going to go. Most of these tendencies produce a backlash sooner or later.
What advice would you give to lawmakers who might be worried about the future of British democracy, about how to potentially soften the blow of a potentially bad situation that we're living through at the moment? What would you tell them?
Well, I've indicated some respects in which the dissatisfaction of young people with democracy can be not removed, but greatly improved. I think there are other things that can be done. I think that our electoral system, which I used to be a supporter of, it needs to be overhauled. When there were effectively only two parties, the effect of first-past-the-post elections was essentially to magnify the effect of electoral swings, so that parties which got less than 50% of the popular vote could get a good deal more than 50% of the membership of the House of Commons. And that, I think, created a great deal of stability and was helpful. With 5 parties, the first-past-the-post can have 21% of the vote. The present government has one of the largest majorities since the war on 34% of the popular vote. I mean, that is a scandalous fact. And the electoral system is responsible for it. If we had a proper proportional representation system, I think that British politics would be a bit less stable. But a wider range of the things that people are concerned about would be catered for by some party or other, and eventually you would have to have a negotiation and probably various coalitions. But that, I think, would be healthy. Coalitions mean that pig-headed politicians can't do exactly what they want because they've got to cooperate with someone else. I don't think that's a bad thing.
Is the solution to our problems just to try and pursue a programme of equality? I mean, that does seem to be the dominant belief of our time.
I don't think it is. I think that equality is a theoretical good, but the methods required to achieve it are not just theoretically, but actually bad and unwelcome to most people. It's not good enough to say, it would be nice if everybody was equal. You've got to ask yourself whether the cost of achieving that, in terms of other values, is worth paying.
Jonathan Sumption, thank you for your time.